Howdy. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the George Bush Presidential Library Center. I'm David Jones. It's my honor to welcome you to tonight's program featuring former Secretary of Homeland Security, Tom Ridge, also former governor of the great state of Pennsylvania, my home state, my governor. So tonight we have a bit of an overflow in the auditorium next door, and we would ask the folks who are there to sit tight after the program. Secretary Ridge and Dean Welsh of the Bush School, who will interview Secretary Ridge tonight, will stop over and say hello. Right after Lori Taylor, who is the director of the Mosbacher Institute at the Bush School, does the concluding remarks a little later on. I want to single out a few of our guests with us tonight, starting with David O'Neill, who is the regional president of Wells Fargo, our sponsor tonight. Thank you, David. Thank you, Wells Fargo, longtime sponsor of the Bush Center. And we also have several of David's associates with us tonight from Wells Fargo. Welcome to all of you. Also with us tonight, Warren Finch, our great library director. Stand up, Warren, so we can recognize you, even though you have the boot on. Sorry about that. And we have with us tonight several members of the Bush School Advisory Board and the Bush School Development Council. Would you stand, please, and let us recognize you and thank you for your service. And included among our Bush School Advisory Board members, also a trustee of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation, is Dr. Ray Bowen, who stood here a second ago. Ray was president of Texas A&M when we dedicated the library 20 years ago. And it does seem impossible that it's been 20 years, but next weekend we will celebrate our 20th anniversary with a series of events. Starting on Friday, October 20th, we have some wonderful panel conversations with representatives of the Bush School and the former deans of the Bush School, Andy Carr and Ryan Crocker, along with Dean Welsh. And the library is putting on two panels during the day that I know you'll find very interesting on research and digitization of the archives. Then on Saturday, the 21st of October, we will welcome here on this stage 11 of President and Mrs. Bush's grandchildren, who at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, please come to that if you haven't RSVP'd. It's going to be really a wonderful afternoon with lots of great grandparent stories and tears and laughter, no doubt, and a discussion of how their grandparents have influenced their lives. So please join us for that. If you need information on it, let us know as you leave this evening. And you may know later on in the day, on the 21st, that's next Saturday, a week from this coming Saturday, we're going to have a small concert in Reed Arena with about 10,000 of our closest friends. And we have a great lineup of country stars coming to sing. And we're going to welcome all 5 former living presidents to the campus. And they'll be here for the program. They'll be speaking that evening. So I hope you got in before the sellout, 12 hours after the tickets went on sale. And if you didn't, let us know, and we'll see what we can do. We'll put you on a waiting list, and you never know. We'll see what we can do. But I hope you'll be able to join us for some of those activities next weekend. So now I'm going to turn the podium over to colleague and friend Andrew Natsios, who is a professor in the Bush School, executive professor, and director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs. Andrew?
Good evening. Following the tragic events of September 11th, 2001, Governor Tom Ridge became the first assistant to the President of the United States for Homeland Security, and on January 24, 2003, he became the first Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. The creation of the country's 15th Cabinet Department marked the largest reorganization of the federal government since the Truman administration, and another call to service for the former soldier, congressman, and governor of Pennsylvania. During his tenure, Secretary Ridge led more than 180,000 employees from 22 agencies to create an agency that facilitated the flow of people and goods, instituted layered security at air, land, and seaports, developed a unified national response and recovery plan, protected critical infrastructure, and integrated new technology and improved information sharing. Before the events of September 11th, Tom Ridge was twice elected governor of Pennsylvania. He served as the state's 43rd governor from 1995 to 2001. He's a graduate of Harvard with honors. After his first year at Penn State University's Dickinson School of Law, he was drafted into the U.S. Army, where he served as an infantry staff sergeant in Vietnam, earning the Bronze Star for Valor, the Combat Infantry Badge, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. He then went back to Pennsylvania, earned his law degree, and later became one of the first Vietnam combat veterans elected to the House of Representatives, where he served for 6 years. We'll then hear by video from Senator Orrin Hatch, who is the most senior Republican in the United States Senate. Among his many initiatives are the balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, the strengthening of our commitment to legal immigration and National America's Security Act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the Americans with Disability Act. Senator Hatch is the chairman of the Senate Committee on Finance. He is also a senior member and former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, a member and former chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and a member of the Joint Committee on Taxation. He also has the honor of serving on the board of directors for the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. General Mark Welsh became the dean of the Bush School, who Dean Welsh will be interviewing Secretary Ridge. Became the dean of the Bush School on August 15th of last year. After retiring from the United States Air Force, Welsh was born in San Antonio, earned a bachelor's degree from the U.S. Air Force Academy, a master's degree in computer resource management, and graduated from the Army Command and General Staff College, the Air War College, and the National War College. He's a fellow of Seminar 21 at the MIT and a number of other positions in different universities. He became the 20th Chief of Staff of the Air Force in August 2012 and served as the Senior Uniformed Air Force Officer responsible for the Air Force, training and equipping 664,000 active duty, Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces serving in the United States and abroad. As a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he and other service chiefs function as the military advisors to the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Council, and of course the President. His most recent previous post was the commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe and the commander of NATO's Air Command. He also served as Associate Director of Military Affairs at the CIA and as Commandant of the United States Air Force Academy, which prepared him for the Bush School. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this momentous conference. While I'm disappointed I can't join you in person, I know you're in very good hands with my friends Governor Tom Ridge and General Mark Welsh. Today, I would like to share my thoughts on how all of you can further contribute to the defense of our country and how, as individuals, you can work to improve our national security efforts. In particular, I would like to highlight the role of human capital in national security. Threats against our great nation will always exist. The name of the threat may change, but there will always be people in this world who want to destroy our country and its people. Currently, we have to focus on Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the Islamic State, including hostile foreign agents within our own borders. These entities wish to do us harm, and they threaten the American way of life. As threats to our security evolve, so too must our ability to adapt to them. And adapting to new threats requires a strong, dynamic workforce. That's where you come in. Talented individuals like yourselves will win us the battles of the future. You've shown your commitment to security and freedom simply by attending this conference. I encourage all of you here to continue investing in your professional development. Continue preparing to serve our collective security. As the infallible General Mattis said, there are hunters and there are victims. By your discipline, cunning, obedience, and alertness, you will decide if you are a hunter or a victim. I want all of you to decide to be hunters. Decide today to be proactive in planning your careers and developing your abilities to protect our wonderful country against those who would do us harm. Rise up to your full potential. Be well educated. Be dedicated to your beliefs. Be disciplined. Be dynamic. Be hunters in your professional pursuits. America is only as good as its people. And today you will hear from the best the nation has to offer. Again, thank you for all you are doing. Keep up the good work. May God bless you, and may God bless America.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great personal privilege to join you, and I'd like to share with you a couple of thoughts as to why it means so much to me to be invited to this library to talk about this issue. Many, many years ago, as a prosecutor, young attorney in my hometown, I was attracted by the qualities of a man who was seeking to run for president of the United States. I loved the range of experience that he had. He had been in the military. He was obviously a patriot and war hero, a business acumen that he had based on the rough and tumble world of the oil industry here in this area, the work he had done in government and in politics, the UN and China. I said, that man ought to be president of the United States. And I'm proud to say that since that time, that back in 1980, not only have I developed a friendship with President Bush and obviously had the honor and privilege of working with his son, but I also have an enormous amount of affection and admiration and respect. So I think I should thank you for giving me an opportunity to engage in this conversation with you at the President's Library. I thank you for that. General and I are going to have a brief conversation. We're going to have a lengthy conversation later on, and I thought what I might do as we begin this conversation is to try to frame, hopefully, those questions around some basic principles. When I view the world, the next challenges for our national security, but I think some basic fundamental principles, hopefully with which we all agree, but within which we can have our discussion. The 21st century is more interdependent and interconnected. The digital ecosystem may be the metaphor, but we are interconnected in so many different ways. It's not just the digital economy. It's not just the supply chain. It's just not that a disease that can affect a population on another continent can ultimately affect us here. We are interconnected. Americans need to understand and appreciate that, and that's certainly something I believe our foreign policy experts and those who advise this and future presidents undoubtedly take into consideration. The second principle around which I think we should frame these kinds of conversations is that national security and economic security are intertwined. They're inextricable. You can't have a strong defense without a strong economy, and you can't have a strong economy without a strong defense. I think we need to understand that. This is something that I firmly believe in, but there may be differences of opinion. But I believe if you accept the notion that the world is interdependent and we're interconnected, and the national security and economic security are tied together, then I believe it is in America's best interest to be more engaged in the rest of the world than less engaged in the rest of the world. And I don't mean just with military and geopolitical. I mean economically. I mean so many other different ways for us to be connected. If you accept that notion, then I think you have to take a look at our history, because it's certainly consistent with the notion that America, post-World War I, certainly in a post-World II era, has demonstrated it is really the only country to date during that period of time that has the reach to develop a comprehensive foreign policy that's global in nature. Not any other country has the ability to do that presently. And for the time being, at least we used to have the capability, the military capacity, to extend our military reach throughout the world. Those are capacities that are being challenged now for a lot of different reasons, but I still think it's fundamental that we think about the next threat and how we deal with it. We think in terms of a country with a geopolitical reach that encompasses the globe and a military reach that is consistent with that point of view, if you believe it's in America's best interest to be more connected rather than less connected to the rest of the world. I think we need to understand that there are three basic ways we can influence events that influence us. Sovereigns act in their own best interest. It's perfectly all right for the United States to do so as well. And sometimes we need to understand that as much as we pride ourselves on our value system and our brand, our foreign policy from time to time cannot necessarily match our interests with our values. In this crazy, complex world, that's not always an objective that we can fulfill. We need to understand there are three ways we can affect policy, three ways we can deal with national security issues. You have the military, you have diplomacy, but you also have the soft power of the American brand, the volunteerism, the NGOs. And yes, indeed, I'm going to tell you, I'm a strong believer in foreign aid, in the right places at the right time for the right purposes. We need to understand that the threat is so more complex in this world, and it has taken on, when I was a soldier in Vietnam, everybody talked about the triad. It was air, land, and sea. Well, since that time, you can add space, and you can add the cyber world. Three theaters of engagement, three theaters of war, all in practice, one place or another, presently as we speak and have this conversation in this auditorium. So, the threat landscape is much more complex than it was when I became Secretary of Homeland Security in 2001. And as a precursor to our conversation, just think about this for a moment. President Bush, 43, for whom I worked, talked about an axis of evil: Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. Somewhat prescient, particularly with regard to Iran and North Korea. Mitt Romney, during the course of a campaign, when asked and he was belittled, said, "What do you think is the greatest geopolitical threat to the country at this time?" He said Russia, and people mocked the response. I wonder if people think and look at Russia a little bit differently today than they did back then. So what's this landscape look like? Well, we have the traditional nation states. We may end up talking in this conversation about China, a very aggressive President Xi, very aggressive foreign policy, taking on the Japanese over islands, extending and building an Air Force base in the South Pacific. And he talks about harmonious collaboration, but we also know he has a very aggressive foreign policy. We need to consider that. We also need to consider the notion that as a strong power, they are an emerging superpower. We had to tread carefully, not to be intimidated, but it's a very important relationship that we need to nurture and use to our advantage. Russia. Do you know, most people don't pay attention to this, but Vladimir Putin, in one capacity or another, has been either the premier or the president or the prime minister since 1998. And now we see a very aggressive nationalism. We've seen it played out in military and cyber action in Estonia, in Georgia, Ukraine. Takes Crimea, nobody pays attention. He's got forces inside one of the eastern provinces in the Ukraine. We look at that. We might certainly talk about Iran. They're going to be a nuclear power. I don't care, regardless of that agreement, in my opinion. It was a flawed agreement. North Korea, how do we deal with that situation? That's an emerging, and it's a real-time threat. How do we deal with it? May come up in our conversation. Wherever I go, they want to talk about terrorism. Well, I understand that. The profile of the terrorists has changed. The geographic location of these terrorist groups have changed. But there's one thing that hasn't changed, and I'm reminded of, and I spent a little time with Benazir Bhutto before she was assassinated, but in a previous speech she had said, you know, you can imprison a man but not an idea. You can exile a man but not an idea. You can kill a man but not an idea. The point being, we're not really war against terrorism. That's a tactic. We are war against a mindset, and we better be prepared to deal with that mindset in one form or another as we look at our national security interest, in my judgment, in perpetuity. The cyber war is going on right now. It's the fifth dimension of war. It's an aggressive posture that they've taken. Multiple countries have taken it. Not only criminal elements supported by nation states, but stealing not only economic secrets, but military secrets. This is the world within which we live. Then and on top of all of that, you take a look at three regions. Look at the discord in Europe. Oh, they thought they could put a European Union together. But you've got the Eurozone currency problem. You've got immigration creating problems. You've got this rise of supranationalism in these countries. So we have to take a look at those historic alliances, and you throw in NATO and say, what's the future, and are they part of our national security vision? And how do we work with them, and do we work with them? Do we work with those alliances? You can look at the Middle East. Iran has its way, they'd be the dominant, but it's still Sunni and Shia. Great implications for us in terms of identifying friends and foes and how we're dealing specifically with them. And then the Korean Peninsula. So if you think about the world as it exists today, I don't believe we've seen a more complex set of threat landscapes. So the question is the policymakers, legislative branch, executive branch, think tanks, how do we address all of these in a way that's consistent with our brand? And our brand is, number one, we do what is in America's interest, but we like to do it with a touch that projects our value system, that protects our brand. That becomes more and more complicated every day as the threat landscape across the globe expands every day. Hopefully those introductory, thoughts and principles, the General and I can have a conversation. One other thought about my friend, President Bush. I was here a couple years ago. He was the honorary chairman of the National Organization on Disability. I'm the chairman. I've been the chairman of that nonprofit for over 10 years. And I was privileged to come down here, and we celebrated the 25th anniversary 2 years ago. I'll never forget the conversation we had with President Bush. We put it on the NOD website, and he talked about all his accomplishments, and he had many, many, many achievements. And you can look at the incredible team he pulled together with Brent Scowcroft and Jim Baker, many foreign policy and domestic achievements. But what gave me a great heart is a man with a great heart said that one of his most important achievements was the fact that he was the president when he got both sides of the aisle to pass the Americans with Disability Act. So it was that kind of reflective, thoughtful leadership that he brought, and howdy the General and I can be as reflective and thoughtful in response to your questions over the next hour or so. Thank you very much.
Howdy, everybody. Howdy, Governor.
Howdy.
Good to have you here. It's really good to have all of you here, but I just want you to notice that I'm sitting next to Tom Ridge. It's a pretty cool thing for me.
I'm at Texas A&M. I can't believe you're all sitting. Come on, man.
You know, as we got ready for this, I was reading a bunch of different material about Secretary Ridge's career, which is just absolutely remarkable. I hope you didn't lose the details in Andrew's introduction, because this is just a remarkable public servant, which is what we're all about here at the Bush School and at Texas A&M. So everybody here is appreciative of your service, sir. But the best thing was all the different characterizations in articles written relatively recently about the secretary. Some people call you a politician, some call you an author, some call you a former soldier, some call you a consultant, some call you a banker. How do you characterize yourself?
Don't call
these
me
days?
late for dinner, though. That's
How do you characterize yourself these days?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I've been blessed with an extraordinary number of opportunities to serve my community and my country. I've enjoyed every one of them. I mean, I said to somebody the other day, I counted 7 different paychecks in my life from different levels of government. I mean, my first job, not that you need to be all that interested, was collecting garbage at a state park. So when I say all work has dignity, I mean it. All the way through a cabinet secretary. I was just at Fort Benning the other day celebrating the 50th anniversary of the non-commissioned officer school during the Vietnam War, shortage of NCOs, and they had a really tremendous course training regimen to train small unit leaders that the NCOs normally provide to the military general. You know that. Your NCOs are the backbone of the Air Force. We think we're the backbone of the military. We're pretty good at what we do, and we celebrated that. And then all these political opportunities I've had. You know, there's a competitive side that likes to win, but winning is just a means to an end. The important part of winning is you get the opportunity to govern. And so I enjoyed being even a minority congressman. It was a time when we could reach across the aisle. If I had a good idea, I could normally get a Democrat to agree to it on the Banking Committee, the Veterans Affairs Committee. And then governor, you're the CEO, and then we move into the opportunity that President Bush gave me to serve. So I've been very blessed. I live in the greatest country in the world, and I've had an opportunity to pay back a little bit. And I still go back to that extraordinary man I met back in '79 and '80 who was running for president. So I'm just to reiterate my gratitude for being here and for you being supportive of a great president who's a great man.
Thank you, sir. You know, we are privileged at the Bush School to represent not just the president, but that unbelievable family.
Yeah.
You have one too. Tell us a little about your family.
Well, I have 2 children, and all I can say is they're good to their dad. They tolerate a crazy lifestyle, even when I was a young man, but in politics. But many of you are here, parents may have served in the military, or you served, and you know, particularly even in general, you know this. I like to think that the men and women in the military, people have no idea what their sacrifices are, because when one spouse puts on the uniform, the other spouse puts on the uniform, and then the kids put on the uniform. And so you're all subject to the call of the chair. Who's the young lady we just met out that was the daughter of your...
I don't want to single her out and embarrass her here.
No,
but let's ask everybody who's
a military person,
family member.
Or military family member or service. Please stand up. I'd like to be recognized in your company. There you go. They're here. So I've got a great family, and all I say is they're a great family. They've been blessed with good health. And I tell them, you wake up in the morning, you've got good health, the rest of the day is up to you. Go do something with it. And they did fine.
Andrew Natsios mentioned in the introduction that you were one of the first Vietnam veterans to go into the Congress. You were actually the first enlisted veteran.
There was the first enlisted man that made it, yeah.
Yeah, which is actually a pretty remarkable achievement.
Well, getting drafted is not remarkable. My brother was 15 years younger, and he thought, God, you got a letter from the president, isn't that great? I said, well, we'll explain it to you when you get a little older. I had 1 year of law school. I spoke a little German. You get the notice. My dad served in the Navy, Second World War, and, well, you're going. You got drafted. And I thought, all right, I'm there. I speak a little German. I got 1 year in law school. Sprechen Sie Deutsch ein bisschen? Ein Glas Bier bitte? I mean, I got this covered. I'm going to spend 2 years, hop on a Eurail, move around the countryside. But then you take a test, and I don't know whether I passed or failed it. I ended up in the infantry. That's okay. You know, I said this to the dean before. I've had a lot of privileges in my life. A lot of ways, met a lot of extraordinary people, done a lot of wonderful things with a lot of people. Nothing of which I'm more proud of is to wear the same uniform for the same country you and I both did. And I have such enormous respect for those, not only who wear the uniform, but the family members who accept one of the most challenging, emotional lifestyles that anybody can possibly imagine. I mean, I've talked to people who've been in the military 35 years and their family moved 20 times. Young lady we talked to whose dad's an Air Force general, she's moved 13 times. I mean, plug that into your nice, comfortable, stable lives and see how exciting you'd be about picking up and moving every 2 or 3 years. So,
Yes, sir. Thank you for that.
yeah, it's true.
What's next for national security? Big topic that we've given the Secretary to reflect on here. Thanks for your opening remarks, sir. I thought they were fantastic. If you open up any newspaper today, whatever you prefer, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Times of London, you pick one. They're all going to talk about the same things, essentially. And they're the things you listed at the podium. And you've looked at these things from a lot of different perspectives now, as a member of Congress, as a governor, as the first Secretary of Homeland Security, an advisor to presidents and wannabe presidents, a potential vice presidential candidate. You've had a lot of angles on this. You mentioned Europe. Let's start there. Where is Europe headed?
You know, I've been trying to wrestle with that because I'm a strong believer in the transatlantic alliance. It's probably the most important economic relationship we have. You know, right after World War II, we built, it's trendy to call it the liberal institutions of the global space. But we built basically a protocol that promoted trade, that promoted globalization, around, with some exceptions, around a rule of law. And we built some military alliances. And it was those multiple relationships, pretty much Eurocentric, that provided a fairly stable platform for the world, around which the world and which the world could operate. Now, ever since they decided, they went from a common market to the European Union, and there's so many indigenous internal forces that seem to be potentially very disruptive of that aggregation. I mean, look at Brexit. I mean, some people say it's a big mistake from UK's part. Time will tell, but I think the notion that some of those supernaturalists, and we've given up some sovereignty to bureaucrats in Brussels, we're not for that. I am, if nothing else out of this, I think they worked their way through the economics. They still have trouble with the whole issue of migration. I don't know how they're going to resolve that. There's still some diffidence. And we're seeing that some of these, I think in Hungary and Poland, suddenly these leaders that used to be more inclined to be centrist are moving very, very conservative and supernaturalist. I think that discord is potentially not in our best interest as a country. And I don't think we can do anything. Those are some internal problems that they're going to have to rationalize themselves. And I don't know what I don't have the crystal ball, but I'm a strong believer in the stability that both the economic alliance and the military alliance has helped create for us as well, not only them, and do worry about the internal forces that right now appear to be very disruptive. I've talked to some people in that region who think they can work their way through this. Time tells. I don't know.
So more engagement, not less.
I perceive more engagement. I mean, I just think it's more important for us to be engaged overseas, whether it's there. And, you know, there's a legitimate difference of opinion of value of alliances. Let's put that on the table right now. But I think America is stronger when it can act together with others. The right kind of relationships are a force multiplier, in my judgment, to what we can do.
Let's spin the globe a little bit here. What's next with China? What's our next step in dealing with China?
President Xi is probably one of the most astute, clever, accomplished leaders on the global scene, at least from my perspective. And what he's been able to do, he has rushed, he and China and his predecessor have rushed to fill the vacuum that sometimes the Americans and the Europeans would fill with foreign aid, primarily, building economic relationships. I read an article the other day that they've got like over 2,000 projects that they're helping finance in Africa, a very important continent for a lot of reasons. But we're still not as engaged in that part of the world as we should be. And they're very much an incrementalist. They haven't done anything so dramatic that causes, the building an airfield in the South China Sea is somewhat problematic, but certainly not going to, it'll be a diplomatic problem. It's not going to be it may be in the long term a military problem, but so they move very carefully. I think this notion that we are the superpower, they are an emerging power, it's probably the most complex relationship we have. And again, there are ways that I think we need to reach out to them and on areas of mutual interest, which I think there are many. Hopefully we can get collaboration. It doesn't seem like we're getting that in the Korean Peninsula right now, but you know this better than I do. The last thing they want is a united Korean Peninsula, but that's not going to happen. And the other thing they don't want is a mass migration of North Koreans across the border. That's probably not going to happen. And I don't think they want to see the nuclearization of the peninsula. They don't want South Koreans to get nukes. They certainly don't want Japan to get nukes. So in time, if we let the process work out, and they have a whole different concept of time than we do, all Asians do, in time, hopefully we can use whatever leverage we have with them, because it's in our mutual interest to try to find some kind of solution to North Korea. And I'm not smart enough to tell you what it is. But it's a relationship that has to be nurtured, because we can't just be so dismissive of it, because it's in our interest to build one based on a recognition that their view of government and society is different from ours. This is not a country we're going to give them a lot of lectures on human rights. We in this United States of America, we are proud of our individuality. We kind of reluctantly have government. They like government. They like hierarchy. For them, it's 50,000 years of civilization, and we're not going to change how they think about government and the role of individual in a society. But they're incrementalists. They move slowly. They move cautiously. And for one, I just wish our president, I like the Trade-Pacific Partnership. I like the notion that we engage people in that region economically. That's one way we can influence events. And if we move back from that, you know who's going to fill it? Even though they're not part of that TPP, they'll figure out a way. If those 11 countries that remain in the TPP decide to come together, form some kind of economic unit, you can bet my words the Chinese will be in there trying to work it to their advantage. So we accept them, who they are, what they do. I just think we have to, I'd like to see a little bit more private diplomacy rather than public diplomacy, that's all.
What about Russia? Is it time to be more aggressive, less aggressive, communicate more, step back?
Well, President Putin didn't need any incentive or any encouragement to stick his nose into our election. They've been doing that for quite some time throughout the European theater. Remember years ago when he observed that the worst thing that happened in his lifetime was the dissolution of the Soviet Union? He believes it. And I'm beginning to think, even though he runs a very repressive regime, there's a lot of Russians that believe it as well. And again, I look back and you ought to ask that. Where's General Scowcroft? What do you think, General? I mean, he's a Russian expert. But I bet you he would tell you that, again, when they made the move into Crimea, the world was pretty mute. When they blew a civilian airliner out of the sky, there was a lot of condemnation, but nothing happened. When they had moved some of their special forces inside that eastern province, and there were a lot of people who report they were already inside. It's not just the militia. They got people helping the militia. The world, and particularly Europe, was quiet. So at some point in time, there has to be a collective response to that kind of aggression. But who will lead that, I don't know. But we get back to your question on Europe. One of the outcomes of some of the challenges that they face in the position that the administration so far has taken toward the transatlantic alliances, as I think when I read about Merkel and Macron, and they have decided that maybe they better step up and do what they can to have a more united Europe to confront the Russian aggression. As the general told me, whenever we get involved in the military or diplomatic effort, we always play an away game. It's like you're going to Florida this weekend, I think. Half your season, whenever we get involved, we're always playing an away game. Well, it's not an away game for Europe. It's their next door neighbor. So I think working with them in the future to be a lot more responsive to that kind of aggression, whether they will or not remains to be seen.
One of the most dramatic things that we've seen in the world over the last 10 to 12 years is the spreading influence of Iran throughout the Middle East. Is there a counter to this? And if so, how does the U.S. get involved in helping it take shape?
I think the Iranians have had a very powerful public relations machine, because ever since Rouhani was elected several years ago, Iran's become a moderate country. And therefore, the suggestion, according to some of the headlines, is that we ought to treat them that way. President Bush identified who they were in 2002. They averaged 3 or 4 public hangings a day. And they imprison political prisoners. There is no freedom of the press. I remember doing an interview some time ago when they asked me about this moderate Iranian leadership. And I said to the broadcaster, I'll be willing to concede that it might be moderate if you and your colleagues in both TV journalism and the major newspapers can set up shop in Tehran and report on everything that's going on. Suggests that they're an open and transparent and moderate society. We haven't seen that. I think, again, full transparency, I thought the nuclear deal was a bad deal. The notion that somehow if they didn't follow the conditions precedent, that somehow we would reimpose the sanctions. Well, within weeks, maybe even before the ink was dry, the Germans were there, Brits were there, everybody was there to sell. It's a big economy, large country, great culture, great history. And they're funding terrorism. They help Hezbollah, Hamas. And so when we took a look at that deal, one, I thought it was a flawed deal. We've never really pushed hard against them for what was identified over 15 years ago. Their interest in being the hegemon in the region, to overtake and displace the influence of the Saudis. And frankly, I thought one of the reasons that they've been able to assert so much more pressure in that region and create so much turmoil is that we drew a line in the sand in Syria. It's the other thing in foreign policy. If you're going to say something, mean it. Our words should be our bond. And if you don't mean it, don't say it. And I think they saw that. I think they saw the failure to respond in a more meaningful way to some of the Russian incursions in Estonia, Georgia, and they just kind of moved in. And now we're going to have, they'll almost build a bridge through the Middle East. And I think the president rightly has identified Saudi Arabia and some of these others as our allies in the region. But again, full transparency, I've been working with a group of probably 40 or 50 diplomats, former military leaders, others in a group called the MEK. They are a diaspora. They are one of several democratic groups. They have a huge diaspora, led by a woman in France. The notion being that when there was a Persian Spring, America didn't respond. And I think one of the things we should think in terms of Iran is there's some indigenous opposition, maybe the MEK, maybe others. It would be helpful if our country and some of the other countries, particularly in Europe, would talk about them publicly and support their aspirations, which are a tolerant, non-nuclear, peaceful, democrat Iran. We have the opportunity to do that. We haven't done it yet, but down the road, hopefully we'll do that. I want to one other thing about Ukraine. I would hope this administration, if you want to send a signal to the Russians, because I was in Ukraine 2 or 3 times in the past year, they're very realistic. They know that the forces on the border, on the eastern province, there's no conceivable way, if that military decided to move across that border, they could ever prevent them from achieving whatever their strategic goals were. But all they said to me on multiple occasions, we've asked for defensive equipment to defend ourselves. We may not win, but as they calculate whether or not they should cross that border, if there ought to be an invasion, they'd have to calculate that there'd be a massive loss of life because we are prepared to defend to the death our sovereignty from the Russians. So I'm hopeful there's some conversations within the administration that we give them some of the equipment that they've asked for but have yet to receive. They asked for the previous administration, they got turned down. Hopefully this administration will honor that request.
You mentioned in your comments terrorism, even domestic terrorism now on everybody's mind. Do you think groups like ISIS will continue to spring from turmoil? And if so, what have we learned from ISIS itself and how we've dealt with it poorly or well that will give us some lessons we should learn for the future?
As painful, I think, as it is, I believe it's important to accept the reality that that global scourge will be a permanent condition, permanent. As we saw September 11th, 19 people with very few dollars, with a strategic objective, obviously some extraordinary planning, what it has done to this country in terms of our response militarily, in terms of what we do to add layered defenses from our borders, let alone walking onto an airport. So we're going to live with this for a while. I think our goals have to be several goals in mind. We can never, ever let them, and here's where it'd be nice to have some more European allies helping us because they have been the victims as well. We can never, ever let them gain a significant piece of territory they had in Afghanistan or in Iraq to build that caliphate, to build a recruiting center, to set up those training capabilities, to establish a beachhead. That'll always be a military objective. The second objective I think we should pursue more aggressively than we have in the past. We have not done a very good job within the Muslim world, particularly those who might be attracted to that ideology of counterintelligence, of counterinformation. I mean, we're pretty good at information warfare ourselves. So what is it you say to these young individuals who decide to sign on to this mission? What is it about this mission that you as a Muslim want to embrace when in fact they have killed more of your religious sect than none? What is it about this vision, this mission, that makes you think that you and the people you care about will actually live a better life under that? So I think we have to be much more aggressive in the counter-intellectual, the counter-informational approach we have in different parts of the world. And then finally, I think the intelligence community knows there are a couple of either nation states, Iran's one of them, I'm convinced, and some others that they still get arms and they still get financing from some people out there, and we ought to be more public in disclosing who it is and do whatever we can to work with our allies to turn off the funnel of funds.
Is the ability to cooperate internationally on this messaging you mentioned relative to the root causes of terrorism getting better or worse?
Yeah. I think it's been in neutral for a long time. Right. I know it may sound strange and it may sound a modest or minimal impact, but somehow these recruits are captured by that belief system. Now, in our world, it's difficult to imagine that, but let's accept the reality that they are. So what's the counter belief system that at least we want to get in front of them to have them rethink. I'm going to get to Turkey and I'm going to work my way to Syria. I'm going to work my way into Mosul. So I don't think we've done a good enough job with that. But I also think that's part of the counter-terrorism strategy. That has to be part of it. The military has part of it. That has to be part of it. And then we have to be more, I think we need to be a little more public to the extent we know who's supplying them the arms or supplying them the funding to secure that capability. We have to be more intense and more focused on trying to shut that down.
You know, a lot of the support for that does come out of the Middle East, various actors in the Middle East.
Yeah, well, it comes out of, some of the individual support comes out of countries that we're trying to work with. I mean, that's how complicated it is. You know what I'm talking about. There's some people in the Middle East and some of the countries we're trying to work with to combat Iran who have principals and leaders and well-financed people that are quietly very supportive.
One of the questions that one of our students gave us to talk about tonight actually leads directly into this area. And the question was, as we work toward energy independence as a country, their concern was that much of our policy relative to the Middle East was built around the energy trade, and for us and our allies. And if we become energy independent, will we walk away from policy development over time that will actually make this problem worse?
Well, I think your student's very intuitive about the question. One, I think we're almost energy independent now, and I can't wait until we're completely energy independent. Two, it's still somewhat problematic because the rest of the world's still dependent on a lot of that fossil fuel out of that region, and our economies, and our economy is based on a lot of global trade and the flourishing economies of other countries. So we may have an indirect interest in seeing that the economies that are addicted to oil from that part of the world still get it, lest their economies tumble. So we have to appreciate that. But I do think that in a very, again, that's where the notion of alliances, it may not be relevant to us, but those other countries who are still dependent on that oil can help us. But again, not from a military point of view, but from the diplomatic side and the quiet process of that kind of engagement, hopefully try to modify their conduct. And the other wonderful thing about being energy independent, listen, I'm an all-in energy guy. I wish I was governor of Pennsylvania, got the Marcellus Shale there. Phenomenal. But I like nuclear too. You're worried about emissions, then build me a couple nuclear plants. I know even in an oil-loving state, I got it, but I like nukes too. But the fact of the matter is, we could export. I'm waiting for us to build the infrastructure to take this wealth that we have discovered because of this unique drilling technique, liquefy it and send it over. And you want to affect a change in Russian policy toward Europe and to kind of lower the revenue they've got coming in, since they get a lot of revenue because they're providing natural gas to our European allies, make them less dependent on Russia for natural gas, fewer revenue dollars, more internal domestic economic strain. I mean, again, it's an interconnected, interdependent world. And sometimes when you push in here, it bulges at the other end.
How do you see the cyber threat now affecting national security?
Yep, sure is. It's the fifth dimension of war. It goes on every day. Government has a role to play, but our government still has to deal with protecting its own infrastructure. They're doing the best they can. I believe one of the challenges that we have in government is you get some of the best and brightest young people in computer science, but they've got a lot of other attractive offers. So getting that capability, building it with inside your government, sustaining it's a real challenge. We know who actors are. The challenge in the cyber warfare domain is pretty simple in my judgment. We can, with greater accuracy every day, attribute where an attack originated. But even the most accurate attribution, which we think we're pretty good at that now, what's our response? How do we hold those actors accountable? So if we know the Chinese and the Russians have stolen secrets from our defense contractors, is anybody willing to say that's an active war? Do we retaliate? And then how do we respond to that? I mean, we've got, and you know more about this than I do, General, because you were very much a part of this during your extraordinary career yourself. We got Cyber Command. I mean, we're on top of this every step of the way. Particularly the military is leading this government in trying to build the capacity to identify the cyber threats and the actors, and whatever private responses they make are private and known only to those who respond. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is within the private sector itself. We do quite a bit of work in cybersecurity in my risk management shop. There is a growing realization. It's not been embedded yet, believe it or not, in corporate America. But it is as much a threat to your profitability, to your brand, et cetera, as the financial risk that you were talked about, that you learned when you went to B school. So when you think about your enterprise, when you think about your company, what you need to think about, just like Deming thought about it when he talked about total quality management, from the CEO all the way down, you better start thinking in terms of cybersecurity or cyber resiliency from the CEO all the way down, because it's going on all the day. People have been saying it for 5 years, but there's only two kinds of companies: those who have been hacked and know it, and those who have been hacked and don't know it. It's a risk. Again, I don't mean to sound like a fatalist, but I believe you deal with reality as it exists and you do your best to change it. But there comes a point in time when you say, I may be able to change it, but I may not be able to eliminate it. That's part of the world. We may be able to change the reach of global terrorism. We may be able to limit their access to geography. We may be able to convince fewer people to join. But I think it's a permanent condition. The same with the cyber risk. The challenge with cyber risk is that the ROI of their investment, the rate of return on their investment, is pretty high. And the cost of defending against their investment is really steep. We have to accept that reality, manage the risk as we possibly can. And then in time, I don't believe that we'll ever reach an agreement with China and Russia. I was in China a couple years ago, ladies and gentlemen. I was invited to speak to an audience of about 3,000 people and about cybersecurity. Well, it means one thing in China, it means another thing in the United States. But I thought as a citizen of this country, former secretary, I had to talk about two issues. As a citizen, I had to talk about privacy. And as a former public official, I had to talk about espionage. And when the remarks were all over, I was invited by the Minister of Information Security, and we had a nice chat. We're drinking tea, and he said to me, "This is really a lovely conversation we're having." He said, "You know, friends drink tea like we're drinking," and he says, "Enemies shoot at one another." And I couldn't resist. I said, "Well, I've done both." And then he went on to complain about false accusations that they were using their cyber capabilities to steal things, and that's economic espionage, but to gather intelligence. And I said, well, one of the students we teach in our military academies is Sun Tzu. And to paraphrase Sun Tzu, he once observed that it's the enlightened leader and the brilliant general that tries to secure as much information on the battlefield before the battle to secure victory. So let's say you're spying on us, you're looking over our shoulder, we're looking over your shoulder. That's a fact of life in the geopolitical world we live in. Let's move on to something else.
So, folks, we started a little bit late, so we're going to finish a little bit late, if that's okay with you. Maybe two more questions. Is that okay?
It's up to them. If you got to go, go.
We hit everything except in North Korea, and you kind of touched on that when you talked about China.
Yeah.
But is there anything else we should be considering relative to North Korea, the actions they've taken, the statements they're making, their drive toward nuclear capability? Anything else we should factor into our own foreign policy based on what you're seeing?
I learned a long time ago, when I ask you a really good question, and you can't add more to what you said before, you just move on. I mean, I'd be very interested in the intelligence community. I'd love to do a psychological profile on this guy. I mean, obviously he's ruthless. A brother, an uncle, very ruthless regime. We know that. We know he doesn't mind starving. The people are just starving to death over there. Is he irrational or is he rational? I can't believe that he thinks that either he or his country could win any kind of military engagement. You'd have to be irrational and delusional to reach that conclusion. How much of it is rhetorical? Does he want more respect than we've shown him in the past? Do we say to ourselves, well, we've lived with a nuclear Russia, we've lived with a nuclear China, we've lived with a nuclear India? I'm telling you, you're going to have to live with a nuclear Iran. I don't care what anybody in the previous administration says. They violated that agreement before they signed it, and they started violating it before the ink was dried. So do we say to ourselves, are we willing to live with that? Any modification of that? So again, I think I'm just going to leave it to where the comments I made before. What's the leverage with China? Is there something wrong with and I got to believe that there's private negotiations, private conversations going on. This is where alliances are important, whether it's China or somebody else. Sometimes if you build the right kind of relationship with leaders of other countries who have a shared interest, they can walk point on the mission, and you can be in the background supporting. So I'm just going to leave it at that. You want to talk about bio too?
Yes, sir. That's the last question.
Oh, all right.
Next Monday and Tuesday, we have the third annual summit on biosecurity and pandemic policy being hosted by the Bush School's Scowcroft Institute. And biodefense actually in many ways is scarier than anything we've talked about so far. And back in 2015, you and Senator Lieberman co-chaired the Blue Ribbon Study panel on biodefense. What were the big things that came out of that panel, and have we moved in a positive direction since you gave your recommendations?
Yeah, well, first of all, we've got some great people here from Texas A&M that are participating in that, and great contributors. Also, is a great reflection when Senator Lieberman called me to be part of a group that has, I know this is going to be amazing to you, ladies and gentlemen. Here, I'm glad you are sitting down. There are 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats who chair it together. We're bonded. We're united. We met several times a year. We came to unanimous conclusions about the study and recommendations we made. It can be done in a very significant way. Give you the Cliff Notes version. We don't, when we think of threats to this country, and we've listed them all, the kinetic, digital, we don't think bio. And when we do think bio, you say, well, isn't there a biological weapons convention? Yeah, well, just about everybody signed it, but our intelligence community will tell you, well, the Chinese, Russians, Iran, North Korea, Syria, sound like the same companies we talked about before. Mm-hmm. They are working on dual-use bioweapons. We know what the other use is. We know that the terrorist groups have talked about it. I remember even as Secretary of Homeland Security, even before that, a briefing I received from the intelligence community about the pathogens they were worried at the time about terrorists getting a hold of. Some were contagious, some were not. So we took a look at it. We had some extraordinary people from around the country. First of all, we don't have a strategy to deal with biodefense. And we can be worried about nation states, and you should, which means we ought to be more involved in that convention, which we pretty much ignored. We understand what terrorists might want to use, but I think the bigger threat is Mother Nature. Pandemics are global. It's on another continent up here. Recently, we had them start in South America. We had them start in Africa. Ended up here. Ebola was one of the pathogens on that list that I saw before the end of 2001. Tell me, how prepared were we for Ebola? We had to hustle around from last-minute protocols with hospitals and the first responders. So I think we need to take this as a serious threat. Again, I don't believe that any of these threats that we've talked about, we should ever be breathless with the notion we can't manage those risks. I'm confident with the right strategy and the right people, all these risks are manageable. But the biodefense is one that we take for granted. There are over 12 cabinet agencies or organizations that have some slice of responsibility for biodefense. There are over 50 political appointees in these multiple agencies that have some slice of responsibility, let alone their staffs. One agency doesn't necessarily know what the other agency is doing. There's no comprehensive strategy, and we're spending several $1 billion a year. So one of the things that Senator Lieberman and I and all 6 of us agreed on, we're not going to participate in any study unless we had both short and long-term policy recommendations, and then we went out and raised money to get people up talking to the policymakers to start to embed these recommendations in the executive branch. The number one recommendation, I don't think it's ever going to happen, but I felt so strongly about it because I saw the impact of Vice President Cheney and his work with me on the Nuclear Detection Office and some of the initial things we were able to do in the biological space. I want to put the Vice President in charge. He can talk to OMB every day. We can find out where their money's going. We can find out whether or not there's redundancy. We can find out if it's being spent in a very cost-effective way. So it's a real challenge. As Senator Lieberman and I often agreed upon, I didn't know what zoonotic diseases were until I took on to this challenge. You know all about it here at Texas A&M. We need to think more in terms of One Health. People, animals, and the environment. You put them together, we need a strategy to deal with that real threat. Again, I'm not so worried about the nation states or the terrorists, but you can think about embedding a contagion in 100 or 200 terrorists and have them come in to this country, different parts of the country, and just kind of roam around for a week or two, and you tell me whether you think we're prepared for that. I want to alarm you. There are people paying attention to it. We just think they ought to pay more attention. But more importantly, I think Mother Nature's, after the eclipse, which was magnificent, 2 extraordinary weather events, God forbid you had to endure one of them here, fires, earthquakes, neighbor in Mexico. If we think we control Mother Nature, powerful force, and one of the most powerful forces is a potential pandemic, not by a nation state or a terrorist group, but Mother Nature throws a pathogen at us that we don't have a medical countermeasure to respond to. So again, we got people working on it. All these risks are real, but they're all manageable. And I'm a believer in the United States. We identify the risk, we figure out a way to tackle it, we'll tackle it.
Sir, for closing comments, in this audience we have a bunch of young and some not so young men and women who came to this university and specifically to this college because they want to serve their fellow citizens. Yeah. You've had a remarkable life doing just that. Any suggestions or advice you'd offer them?
Yeah, I've met a couple of the students before this meeting. We had about 15 or 20 students, and I've always enjoyed the interaction with students, high school, college, grad school. When you hang around with the grade school kids, I remember going to a second or third grade class one time, and when I was a young congressman, and the teacher must have told them the congressman's coming, so they ran home and either told their mom or dad, their grandma and grandpa. Little girl in the back of the room was waving her hand. She said, "Are you going to cut my Social Security?" So there are certain audiences that are a little bit more tuned into it than others. But I had a great conversation with some of the graduate students here, and the only thing I'd say to them and undergraduates, and I think Senator Hatch talked about it in his own gentle but very powerful way. In any organization, whether it's the military, government, company, nonprofit, you can have the best of everything, you can have all the money, you can have the technology, but the most important element for the success of that organization is capable, highly motivated people. And what I've said to young people is that you have no idea how rewarding an experience, and I spent most of my life, I practiced law for 10 years, but I've been 25, 30 years in government. The rewards of public service are difficult to describe. But whether you're working at the local government level or you're privileged to work at the federal level and everywhere in between, and I don't mean elected office. The worker bees are the men and women who try to make government work, who try to take whatever the policy is and execute it in a way that makes a difference in people's lives. So I said, if you're a biology major, we need good lawyers. We need good HR people. I mean, whatever that specialty is that brings you here, if you're interested in public service, I hope that you take your experience and your desire to serve into the public arena. You'll find it probably more fulfilling than you could imagine. You don't have to stay there for a career, but you might become addicted like some of us have to the opportunity to serve. And I commend you for, first of all, in order to get to the graduate school here, you had to do pretty well, demonstrate your capabilities before you got here. But I would encourage you to look at it. I think it's something that you'd feel good about your contributions. One of great prizes in life, I think Teddy Roosevelt once said this, is hard work worth doing. Well, public service in many different forms is hard work. But I'll tell you, it's worth doing. Good night. Congratulations, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair.
I'm breathless, and I'm terribly impressed, and I'd like you to join me in another round of applause for our amazing speakers. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and hope that you have found this a very fulfilling and intriguing evening. I'd invite you to join the Scowcroft Institute and the Mossbucker Institute again for some of our coming attractions. We've already had a really impressive introduction to our Pandemic Preparedness and Global Health Innovation Forum, which is available to you on the afternoon of October 17th. It's open to the public. We invite you to come, and we're going to bring together faculty and administrators from the TAMU community with individuals from the private sector, primarily folks from technology, vaccine development, and oil, to discuss the role of corporate global citizenship in preparing for and responding to pandemics. Then I'd like to also invite you to attend the McLean Leadership and Business Award on November 6th, where John Now, the chairman and CEO of Silver Eagle Distributors, and the chairman of the Texas Historical Commission will receive the award and speak on leadership lessons from history. And finally, I'd like to make sure that you're aware of an event we have coming up on November the 15th, NAFTA 2.017, Strengths, Weaknesses, and Ways Forward, featuring Carla Hills, the U.S. trade negotiator for NAFTA, and a panel of scholarly specialists in the area of U.S. trade, including the president of the university, Michael Young. So please plan to join us for all of these wonderful events. They're going to have to really work hard to keep up and meet the standards set by these gentlemen this evening, but I know they're up to the task. So please, thank you, and come again.